So welcome everybody tonight here in New York, and afternoon on the US West Coast, and morning in Japan. This is our December session of the Keio-Columbia Cyber Dialogue. Again, many have been active participants for it's almost 2 years of activity so far. We have I think a interesting but also very timely, topical discussion focused tonight around cyber norms and how they relate to ransomware. But I think we're going to extend it also to how those norms are being taken up or not being taken up globally. And I think the dialogue definitely should get into how that will affect the challenges of ransomware. This is the second session we've had in a couple of weeks. I'll close with what's planned for next year. Again, I appreciate everybody being here. And we'll probably just drive right into it. Again, two speakers tonight, both, thankful that both these people who I've worked with over the years are with us tonight to give their perspectives. I'll do very quick introductions, and if there's any other sort of things that they want to say about their background that's relevant to the topic, they will. So Michael Daniel, who's hopefully known to many, or if not most of us, long service in the U.S. government, including long service in the White House, where he was in the Office of Management Budget for an extended time, working on a number of national security issues, but then was called upon by President Obama to take over really the National Security Council staff and direct it related to cybersecurity. So he did that until 2016, and then has been the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a collaborator on many things across both industry, government, policy, and did support very heavily the Columbia New York Cyber Task Force recently, and was a co-director of the recent ransomware task force sponsored by the Institute for Security and Technology. So I'm going to have Michael start, and then I'm going to have Koichiro Komiyama, also known to many of us as Sparky, go second. So I'll introduce Koichiro after Michael's remarks. So with that, Michael, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Greg. I appreciate it, and happy to be here and talk about this issue related to cybersecurity norms. So, this cybersecurity norms, this dialogue, this debate on the norms has been going on for quite some time, and has actually been a topic of significant discussion in the international community for at least the last decade or so. In fact, when I was on the NSC staff, we hammered through the interagency process a set of 4 norms that the United States started promoting related to responsible behavior in cyberspace. And since that time, there's actually been, I would argue, some fairly broad agreement that has emerged through several different UN processes, particularly the Group of Governmental Experts process. And really, there are sort of 2 things that I would say that have come out of that process. One is that the majority of states have agreed that international law applies in cyberspace the same way that it applies in the physical world. Which at one level sounds kind of almost trite, but in fact was an open question for some time. And there were several countries and people that argued that we actually needed a new type of international law to apply to cyberspace, that it was so different, so unique, so separate from the physical world that we needed different international law. But most countries, although not all, and Sparky will actually talk about this in his remarks, I think. The majority of states have actually signed on and have said, yes, international humanitarian law applies in cyberspace like it does in the real world. Okay. And now through that UN process, we have about 11 different norms that have really been broadly agreed to by several different groups of governmental experts, and so reaffirmed by the UN. So I'm actually going to share my screen, and can everybody see the PowerPoint slide there? All right. So essentially, there are 11 norms that have been broadly agreed to, as you see on the screen there. One is that you should seek to increase stability and security while not doing harmful things. The second norm, I think, was actually honestly, I'll say this, that it was aimed largely at the United States for making attribution statements. But really, it sort of says that you should consider all relevant information when making attribution statements. Don't allow your territory to be used for malicious activity. You should cooperate to share information and prosecute cybercrime. You should respect human rights and privacy. This next one is kind of a critical hinge one, which is do not disrupt critical infrastructure during peacetime. The full norm actually talks about don't use offensive cyber capabilities in contravention to international law. But really, this is aimed at protecting critical infrastructure. And then says, protect your own critical infrastructure. The norm says you have an affirmative duty to respond to requests for assistance. And then you also are supposed to ensure the integrity of the supply chain and encourage responsible reporting of vulnerabilities. And then the last one was sort of always referred to as the Red Cross principle. Do not attack another country's computer emergency response teams, sort of the equivalent of hospitals in cyberspace. Don't attack them during peacetime. So those were the 11 norms that have really received broad agreement, across a lot of the UN space. And in my view, it's unlikely that entirely new norms are going to emerge at any point in the near future. What we'll get is additions or extensions of these existing norms, such as don't disrupt the international financial system or protect the public core of the internet. And really, in my mind, those are specific examples of, norm 6, which is really, protecting critical infrastructure during peacetime. So if that's the case, and there's sort of this emerging sort of consensus around these norms, you've now had a lot of international experts that have started to actually focus on accountability. What are the mechanisms available to punish those who violate these norms? And certainly countries are going to violate these norms. And while that's an important discussion, the one that I actually want us to, or I would propose that we spend some time talking about today in the dialogue, is the other side of the coin. How do we actually help and enable countries that want to uphold the norms? How do we actually start doing that? How do we actually start abiding by the norms? How does the United States start acting in ways that clearly uphold these norms? How does Japan do that? Because there are some next level questions in actually implementing the norms that we have to think about. That cyberspace promotes in a way that, or enables in a way that physical space does not. So to be very concrete, when it says, the norm that says, you are supposed to respond to international requests for assistance, how do you operationalize that? How do you actually make that work across international boundaries in a reasonable fashion? what's a reasonable timeline for responding, right? How do you deal with the fact that what China calls malicious activity, we in the United States often call free speech? So we have those kinds of issues. It says, the norm says, do not knowingly allow your territory to be used for malicious activity. Okay, well, that's a pretty clear norm, but I would say that even for the United States, one of the biggest sources of, or even one of the biggest sources of botnets on the internet are computers and devices in the United States, because we have so many IT devices. So how would we actually show that we were taking that norm seriously? How can we share intelligence effectively across international borders? How do we do that not just in formal intelligence relationships between governments, but how do we actually enable that information to flow at speeds that actually matter for the purposes where speed actually matters? And speed does not always matter in every single case, but in certain circumstances it does. And we want that information to flow pretty readily. And then another piece that Greg and I have actually spent a lot of time talking about is, and then how do we actually take coordinated action to uphold the norms, particularly against cybercrime? How do we actually coordinate both in time and in effect the disruption of criminal networks? Right now, we actually don't do a very good job of coordinating those activities between governments and between governments and the private sector. Now, we've seen examples where, particularly over the past year, where the US government is trying and has done some more coordinated work with particularly some of its Five Eyes partners, the UK and Australia and others. But I would say that there's still a long way to go in having the kind of disruptive effect that we want to have so that we can actually uphold these norms that we're talking about. And so in my view, and this is where we're actually going to get into Koichiro-san's remarks as well, there are also various gradations of how countries are interpreting these norms across the board. And he's going to talk about that in more detail, particularly from some really big players in cyberspace, including India and Indonesia and Brazil and places like that. So to my mind, and those countries have a different view than largely the US or Japan or Europe. But even given that, there are differences between the US and Europe and Japan in how we think about these norms. And so I think that this kind of dialogue is very useful for looking at some of these questions. What are the new structures, institutions, or processes that we need to build to support norm adherence? Or how do we build those structures and processes to identify norm violations? And I think all of those things are going to, in some cases, we can repurpose existing structures and institutions to do that. But in some cases, we might need to build entirely new things. And that is where I think we can start to explore these ideas. And in particular, I also think that we should not, and what I'll close with is saying, we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or the fact that we cannot always 100% guarantee, for example, that even the US, that we will be able to prevent all malicious activity from emanating from the United States. But we should not, therefore, let the fact that we can't be perfect at it stop us from starting to stop us from adhering to the norms as much as we can and promoting them as a way of ensuring stability in cyberspace. And so that's where I want to close, Greg, and I think it's a good way to segue into the next segment.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Yep, I think that's right. It's time to hear from Koichiro. If I get this wrong, you'll correct me. Komiyama. The reason that I probably have not said that name as many times as I've collaborated over the years with Sparky is that many in the community, as he's led, from the Japan side, have used that shorthand for working with him. So with that, he is a leader in the international community. He's the director of the Global Coordination Division of the JPCERT Coordinating Center. He's been a board member of FIRST, the Global Forum of Incident Response Teams, and recently received his PhD from Keio. So Sparky, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Greg. And good morning, everyone. My name is Koichiro from both JPCERT CC and Keio Global Research Institute. So I'd like to introduce a few topics, share a few topics with you this morning. Cyber norm discussion, of course, should be a global initiative. Patterns of behavior in the third world, such as Asia and Africa, are rarely discussed. So I'd like to introduce the recent norm discussion and initiative of key players such as ASEAN and India, and hopefully introduce their principle behind them, behind their behavior. Move on to the next slide. However, I need to start from the Japan's current status. If you are following the Japanese cybersecurity policy activities, we just published the 2021 cybersecurity strategy. So I spent 2 minutes to introduce this, to share this with you. Cybersecurity strategy is not a law, it's not a bill approved by our national diet. It is a guidance drafted by Cybersecurity Strategy Headquarters and approved by Cabinet. Every 3 years we have new strategy, and that is why this document best reflect short-term policy priorities and focus area of Japan. And I have 2 important points from this new strategy. First, it is the new strategy is very clear on warning or risk of China, Russia, and North Korea. 2021 strategy expresses a sense of urgency about the expansion of offensive cyber capability of China, Russia, and North Korea. This naming of specific countries was not seen in our previous strategy. Change might be the sign of shift in key players in the government. For the last 2 decades, ministry supervised the information communication or economy. They had strong influence on cyber. Previous strategy was written according to their style, so as not to make the adversary clear. And it looks like they're trying to avoid ambiguity with current strategy. And my second point from this new strategy is strong expectation for international cooperation, especially the US-Japan alliance. How will Japan counter the growing threats from those states? It says Japan will strengthen its defense and enhance its ability to identify attackers and hold them accountable for deterrence through international cooperation. The strategy document says Japan will work with the UN, US, Australia, India, and ASEAN. However, unlike the strategy of UK or Australia, Japan's strategy does not plan enhancing its offensive cyber capability. And instead, strategy cites an agreement on the US-Japan 2+2 talks in 2019, which US and Japan agreed that a cyber attack could, in certain circumstances, constitute an armed attack for the purpose of Article 5 of US-Japan Security Treaty. In my own word, a major cyber attack against Japan would trigger the right of collective self-defense, and the US military could launch a counter cyber attack or counter attack. So by citing this agreement, Japan is aiming Japan's anticipating the deterrence effect. And the last point, my third point is relevant to the topic of discussion this morning. Continued participation in the discussion of the norm is surely included in this new strategy. However, norm is mentioned less frequently when compared to previous strategy. And I can sense, I would say, the lack of sense of enthusiasm on norm discussion and norm development. The good news is Japanese private sector did not lose its momentum. So more and more Japanese private companies signed norms proposed by private sectors, which includes Paris Code, TECA Code. TECA Code is led by Microsoft and others. Charter of Trust is proposed by Siemens, Germany. So right now, the active player in the space is private sector. Move on to the next slide.
Sparky, you there? I think we may have technical.
Completely different Chinese entity. And
Sparky?
yes?
For some reason, after you switched the slides, we lost your voice for about 15 seconds. Maybe you can go back to the start of this slide.
Okay. So the reason I like to share the, I like to talk about the ASEAN's norm development with you is because during this summer, I had the opportunity to discuss cybersecurity issues with Chinese and Korean scholars. I had two different meetings with two completely different Chinese institutions, and they both asked me if Japan in general is interested in co-sponsoring or supporting Chinese initiative to assist ASEAN's cybersecurity, for example, exercises. Chinese foreign minister in September published a statement that China to work more with ASEAN in the area of cybersecurity and ICT, and seems like they're becoming more active toward ASEAN. So what has ASEAN done so far to advance cyber norms? I classify ASEAN efforts in two areas: the diplomacy and cyber capacity building. ASEAN maintains its principle, recognizing that norms and the rule of law is needed for cyberspace. And ASEAN, they are the first regional organization agreed in principle to be guided by the 2015 GG norms. The political declaration accept GG norm was made in both ASEAN leaders' statement in ASEAN Summit. Also, ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity called AMCC back in 2018. So they are way ahead of other regional cooperation mechanism, and ASEAN surely is interested in or active, has been active in this field. Why ASEAN could become first organization to do this? Eugene Tan, a scholar based in Singapore, argued that the similarity between the 11 norms, 11 GG norms, and obligation or mandate in the ASEAN Charter is the main reason for the relatively swift adoption. For instance, the norm calling on states to not knowing allow their territory to be used for international wrongful act using ICT. This norm can be mapped onto Article 2, subsection 2K of the ASEAN Charter. This subsection is calling on ASEAN member states to abstain from participating any policy or activity, including the use of territory pursued by any ASEAN member states or non-ASEAN member states, which threaten the sovereignty of, Another reason I can see is the influence of Singapore. If look at the ASEAN as a football team, Singapore is a quarterback. They are the game maker. ASEAN policy is not entirely, but to some extent, shaped by Singapore and their own political interest. For the capacity building, ASEAN leverage its relationship with other states within and outside of the region. Different ASEAN member states have stood up initiative to provide capacity building program in collaboration with others, such as the ASEAN Japan Cybersecurity Capacity Building Center in Thailand and ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence in Singapore. These measures can help ASEAN member states understand cyber threats better and may lead them to reach a common understanding on what cyber norms and international law mean to ASEAN. Next slide, please. I hope you can hear my voice.
We're good. Yep.
Cool. So move on to India. Why we are talking about India in this US-Japan dialogue? Because they are the cornerstone or backbone of free and open Indo-Pacific. And India is a perfect example of what researcher describes as digital decider or cyber swing states. India positions itself in the middle ground. Their priorities are to reduce cybercrime and to bridge the digital divide. And their priority are not the freedom of expression or other fundamental human rights. And this made India's position very unique. So looking back, while India has participated in 5 of the last 6 GGEs, it has not clearly stated how India interpret the international law and how it applies to cyberspace. Even their voting pattern at the UN meeting has also been inconsistent. Sometimes it voted in favor of Russia's cybercriminal proposals, which was highly criticized by civil society. It has not ratified the Budapest Convention and has not signed the Paris Goal. So they have different priorities. Sometimes they are not in line with US, Japan, and other democracies. At the same time, India feel very clear pressure from its giant neighbor. So India, a few years ago, banned Chinese apps. India has, they still have territorial dispute with China, and China, in line with their digital Silk Road or One Belt, One Road initiative, China support Pakistan, India's library. China supports Pakistan's digital infrastructures. So fiber optic cables running through China to Pakistan, and the cooperation around that area is becoming more and more active. So India has a legitimate reason to fear or legitimate reason to worry about Chinese expansionism. Let me conclude with my last slide. So here are a few food for thought for our attendees this morning. First of all, there's a increasing liquidity at the middle ground. I introduced India as a example of middle ground, but Indonesia, South Africa, and other Asian and African countries, they have similar voting and behave. They behave in a similar way, and this matters to us because next billion of internet users not coming from Europe or US, they're coming from Asia and Africa. Talking about ASEAN, I think ASEAN consists of 10 different states, but we need to have a closer look at to these 10 states. And right now, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, so the three countries in Malay Peninsula, these states deserve more assistance from Western world because they are geopolitically closer to China, and they need urgent support right now. Another very different thoughts is Mongolia and Bangladesh. They are the key. How do I say it? So for example, Mongolia is sitting in between China and Russia. Probably the not the place you like to sit in, but Mongolia has been supporting freedom of expression on the internet. They are the member of Freedom Coalition. However, because they are not the ASEAN member states, because they are not the member of any alliance, they didn't receive not much assistance from Japan or from other countries. So these countries is exploring their way to contribute the international cooperation. Japan and the United States can do many things for them. That concludes my remark. Thank you for your attention.